It was one of those leaden afternoons in late October when London wears a mask of melancholy and the gas lamps flicker prematurely against the rising fog. I'd been reading the Times with diminishing interest when a sharp rap at the door of our Baker Street rooms roused me from a particularly dull column on municipal drainage improvements. "Visitor," murmured Holmes without glancing up from his Persian slipper, which served as his eccentric tobacco pouch. Mrs. Hudson entered, a card upon her tray. Holmes reached for it with his long fingers. "Signor Ernesto Villani," he read aloud, "of the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale, Florence." His eyebrows lifted a fraction. "A librarian from Tuscany. Now there's an aroma of the unexpected." "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." The man who entered was spare and scholarly, with olive-toned skin and a meticulously waxed mustache. His dark eyes darted about our sitting room, appraising it with a certain academic fastidiousness before settling on Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his accent heavily inflected, "I have come on a matter of the utmost peculiarity. I was told that if any man in London could decipher not merely symbols, but intentions, it would be you." "You do me honor," said Holmes, gesturing him to a chair. My friend and chronicler, Dr. Watson Villani, inclined his head. "Doctor, I fear my tale will sound bizarre, even operatic, but I assure you there is more at stake than mere manuscripts." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Proceed." Villani drew from his satchel a thin parcel wrapped in oiled paper. With great care, he unwrapped it to reveal a folio-sized parchment, aged and curling at the edges. "This," he said, laying it reverently upon our table, "is a fragment of a cipher recovered last month from the estate of the late Marchese di Spoleto. It is believed to be the only surviving piece of the so-called Florentine cipher, a Renaissance document shrouded in enigma." Holmes leaned forward, the sharp gleam in his eyes signaling his keen interest. The parchment was covered in ornate, looping script, Latin perhaps, but with frequent interruptions of symbols, interlocking rings, astrological figures, and what seemed like musical notations. "What is the provenance?" Holmes asked, already examining it with his lens. Villani hesitated. "Officially, it was discovered during an estate inventory. Unofficially, it was stolen before we could secure it properly. I retrieved it from a collector in Naples who was persuaded to relinquish it. But during my return to London, where I intended to deliver it to a British patron with ties to the Ashmolean, it vanished from my hotel room. 3 nights later, it reappeared, unguarded and untouched, precisely where it had vanished." Watson blinked. "A theft and return without ransom." "Exactly," said Villani. "And this morning, a note was slipped beneath my door." He eyed, produced a smaller, more modern envelope. Inside was a folded sheet, unlined, with letters clipped from periodicals and pasted into a chilling composition. "Florence remembers. You have 3 days. The cipher is not yours." Holmes handed the note to me and tapped the cipher with a long forefinger. "This is no ordinary code," he said. "What precisely is it believed to conceal?" Villani's voice lowered. "Legend holds that the cipher contains the encoded location of an unregistered Medici stronghold. Not just treasure, Mr. Holmes. Documents, state secrets from the 16th century, some of which would embarrass even the most distant descendants." Holmes rose and paced to the window, staring through the misted glass at the dim blur of Baker Street. "And this British patron who commissioned your delivery, does he suspect the same?" "I believe he suspects more. He has not contacted me since the theft. It is as though he has vanished." "And his name?" Villani hesitated. "Viscount Henry Devries, late of Suffolk, a collector of, shall we say, peculiar relics of European origin." Holmes nodded. "Yes, I know the man. His house in Sudbury is said to contain a bust of Caligula with an ivory tongue." At this, I let out a short laugh, but Holmes did not join in. "Dr. Watson," he said crisply, "note the following. A Renaissance cipher disappears and reappears. A mysterious warning is issued. And now we have a nobleman gone to ground, if not the grave." He turned sharply to Villani. "I presume you have kept the letter and cipher entirely private?" Villani nodded. "Beyond the collector in Naples, and yourself, no one else knows." Holmes smiled without humor. "Then someone is watching you far more closely than you imagine." The clock on the mantel chimed 4. Holmes turned to me. "Pack your bag, Watson. We are going to visit Viscount de Vries, provided he has not already become a footnote in the history he so covets." And with that, the game was once again afoot. It was early the next morning when Holmes and I found ourselves aboard the 8:32 express out of Liverpool Street, bound for Suffolk. The sky hung heavy with the promise of rain, and the flat countryside sped past the carriage windows in shades of grey and brown. Holmes sat silent for the better part of the journey, his long frame coiled like a spring, eyes half-lidded, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. To the casual observer, he might have appeared to be dozing, but I knew better. My friend was deep within the recesses of his mind, calculating, sorting, and eliminating possibilities like a master chess player evaluating a dozen moves in advance. I busied myself with a volume of The Lancet I had brought along, though I found myself rereading the same paragraph several times. My thoughts kept circling back to the cipher, to the ominous letter, and to Viscount de Vries, a name that echoed dimly in the halls of London society, though seldom in flattering tones. As we neared Sudbury, Holmes stirred. "You are familiar with the ancient concept of damnatio memoriae, Watson." I glanced up. "Latin, is it not? Condemnation of memory." "Precisely," he said, his voice sharp with awakening thought. "An old Roman practice, erasing a man not only from life but from history. Names chiseled out of stone, records altered or destroyed. A fitting concept, perhaps, for a man like de Vries." "You think someone is attempting to erase him?" I asked. Holmes tapped a gloved finger against the fogged pane. "Let us reserve judgment, but consider, Watson, the cipher vanishes and reappears. No ransom, no damage. A warning appears, its phrasing strangely theatrical, and the patron who had every reason to claim the manuscript now chooses silence. Either de Vries is hiding, or someone has decided to begin erasing him." The carriage jolted as we arrived at Sudbury Station, a modest affair of iron girders and a sagging canopy. A brougham was waiting, sent from de Vries' estate. Holmes had arranged it by telegram before we departed. Our driver was a man of few words, a stocky fellow with a cap pulled low over his brow. He answered Holmes's inquiries about the Viscount with a single, well-rehearsed sentence. "His lordship's been indisposed these 3 days. Visitors not received." Holmes raised an eyebrow at this, but said nothing further. The road from the station wound through autumn-tinted woods and over narrow bridges until we reached the estate gates of Rookhaven Manor. The house itself was a peculiar fusion of Tudor and Italianate design. Half country manor, half Medici fantasia. Weathered stone lions stood guard at the foot of the drive, and ivy strangled the southern facade. Yet it was the windows that drew my gaze. Dark, every one of them, as if the house were abandoned. A liveried footman met us at the door and confirmed what the driver had already said. "His lordship is unwell. Orders are to admit no one." Holmes drew himself up, his tone calm but implacable. "You will kindly inform the Viscount that Mr. Sherlock Holmes is here on a matter of considerable urgency, one which involves a theft, a threat of violence, and a document which once passed through his hands." The footman hesitated, glanced at our shoes, muddy from the walk up the gravel drive, then disappeared into the house. We were left in the entryway, surrounded by gloomy oil portraits and the stale smell of furniture polish. Minutes passed. Finally, a voice echoed down the hall. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, do come in." It was not De Vries who greeted us, but a woman of indeterminate age with a manner of crisp efficiency. She introduced herself as Miss Forsyth, secretary and housekeeper to the Viscount. "Lord De Vries has been quite ill," she said, gesturing us toward a drawing-room lined with shelves of grotesque curios, skulls, taxidermy, and a mummified hand beneath glass. "A recurring fever. I must apologize for his absence, but I can answer what questions you may have." Holmes did not sit. Was it before or after the disappearance of the Florentine cipher that the Viscount fell ill? She blinked. Pardon?" "The manuscript," said Holmes, tone clipped. "You are aware of its passage into this house?" Miss Forsyth's lips pressed together. "I know nothing of any manuscript. Lord De Vries has acquired many items over the years, but none matching your description." "Then perhaps you will permit me to speak with his lordship directly." "That would be impossible," she said, a shade too quickly. "His condition is delicate." Holmes studied her closely. "Does he receive correspondence?" She hesitated. "Only from his solicitor. And medical attention. We have a private physician from Cambridge. He was here 2 days ago." Holmes turned to inspect the room. I noted the faint scent of tobacco, not the Turkish blend the Viscount was known for, but something cheaper, more common. A glass on the side table bore the print of pale lipstick. A discarded calling card lay half-tucked beneath a stack of books. Mademoiselle Claudine Vervin, Paris. Holmes's eyes flicked across these details without a word. "May I see his lordship's study?" he asked. Miss Forsyth shifted uncomfortably. "It has not been used of late." "All the better," Holmes replied. Reluctantly, she led us up a broad staircase and down a passage lit by arched windows. The study was a high-ceilinged room smelling of dust and old vellum. Books were stacked in teetering towers. A large desk faced a cold hearth, and above it hung a map of 16th-century Florence, annotated with inked notations in Latin and Italian. Holmes moved quickly. He examined the inkwell. Still damp. A scrap of paper had fallen behind the desk. He retrieved it with forceps from his pocket. It was part of a page torn from a ledger, or diary, in shaky but legible handwriting. "Cifrato incompleto, requires symbol for bell. Do not trust the Frenchwoman. She knows more than she says." Holmes handed it to me and returned to the desk. He ran his hand along the underside and pressed something. With a soft click, a panel in the side popped open to reveal a hidden compartment. Empty. "Too late," he murmured. "What was inside?" I asked. He did not answer directly. "Miss Forsyth," he said instead, "have any visitors come in recent days, besides the physician?" Her face remained composed, but her hands gripped one another tightly. "No." "Then the mademoiselle whose card lies downstairs must have arrived invisibly," he said, strolling past her. An impressive feat for someone wearing coty powder and Valentino perfume. Her face flushed, but she said nothing. "Watson," said Holmes, "we are not being told the whole story. Viscount De Vries may be ill, or he may be very much in danger. Either way, the cipher's trail leads not just to history, but to betrayal." We left the study and passed down the long corridor once more, the air chill and thick with unease. Somewhere within that house, a man either languished behind locked doors or had been spirited away in silence. As we stepped back into the fog outside, Holmes lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl skyward. "We must return tonight," he said, "but not as guests." The fog had thickened by nightfall, draping the countryside in a damp shroud as impenetrable as ignorance. Rookhaven Manor loomed ahead of us once more, but now it was a fortress in all but name. From our vantage point atop a ridge east of the estate, the house stood as a silhouette of secrets, its turrets just visible against the milky moonlight, its many windows dark as the eyes of a blind man. Holmes crouched beside me, peering through his field glasses. 2 sentries, he murmured, though neither wears a uniform. One by the carriage house, the other near the conservatory. Curious, wouldn't you say, Watson? Very, especially for a man supposedly bedridden with fever. He handed me the glasses. The figures were indeed posted at odd intervals, and their bearing, rigid, watchful, was unlike that of ordinary staff. Their attention roved across the grounds like dogs scenting the wind. "What's our play?" I asked in a low voice. Holmes smiled faintly. "You shall do precisely what you do best, Watson. Accompany me into danger with steady nerves and a serviceable revolver." "I expected no less," I replied, slipping the familiar weight of my pistol into my coat pocket. We waited for the nearest sentry to wander a few yards eastward before descending the slope and hugging the tree line. Holmes moved with uncanny fluidity, every step calculated and silent. I followed, suppressing the crinkle of dead leaves underfoot as best I could. We circled behind the manor, keeping low behind a hedge of bramble until we reached a low, arched window partially obscured by ivy. Holmes produced a narrow tool from his coat and had the latch undone in less than a minute. We slipped through into darkness. The room we entered was unlit and stale-smelling, some sort of side pantry or scullery. Holmes paused, eyes shut, nostrils flaring. "Brandy. Turkish tobacco. Someone's been here recently." A thin sliver of light glowed beneath the door ahead. Holmes crept forward and pressed his ear to the wood. "Voices," he whispered. 2. Male. One older, deliberate. The other, a touch of panic. He straightened, then pointed silently to the side, indicating that I should circle to the adjacent chamber while he would approach from the hallway. I obeyed, navigating through what proved to be a storage room crammed with crates and faded furniture. Through a slim doorframe on the far side, I glimpsed the source of the voices, a library with heavy velvet curtains and oil paintings that gleamed dully in the candlelight. "I tell you, if De Vries is still in the country, it's only because she's hiding him," the younger man snapped. "And what do you propose?" came the slower, more sardonic reply. "We cannot simply announce his disappearance, nor can we keep the cipher here indefinitely." "There's been no word from Paris." "No instructions." "The mademoiselle is not a woman one rushes," said the older voice. I held my breath as I watched the scene unfold. 2 men stood near the fireplace, one tall and angular with a cravat askew, the other round-shouldered and paunchy, his jowls drooping like a bloodhound's. Neither was familiar to me. Suddenly, a third figure emerged from the side hallway. Holmes, now dressed in a servant's frock coat and cap, face shadowed. "Beg pardon, sirs," he said in a perfect Suffolk drawl. "There's someone at the back door asking after the lady. Frenchwoman, she says she is." The younger man stiffened. "She's not due until tomorrow." "Seems she changed her plans," Holmes muttered. "Had the look of one who doesn't like to be kept waiting." "I'll go," said the younger man, brushing past Holmes and exiting the room. Holmes turned to the older man, who had already reached for a cane near the hearth. Holmes's tone changed abruptly. "Sit down, Mr. Penner. You've no cause to flee just yet." The man froze. Holmes stepped fully into the room and I entered from the other side, revolver drawn. The older man's eyes widened. "I know you," he said. "You're Sherlock Holmes. I take it as a compliment that my fame extends even to clandestine smugglers," Holmes replied evenly. Penner, if that was indeed his name, lowered himself back into the chair, grumbling, "You're wasting your time. There's no crime here." "No?" Holmes crossed to the fireplace and touched the mantel. "You're in possession of a cipher stolen from a Florentine archive, being used to extract blackmail, no doubt, or to acquire leverage among private collectors. And unless I miss my guess, Viscount de Vries is being held somewhere on these premises against his will." Penner sneered. "You've no proof." "Then let us acquire some." Holmes turned and pointed to a wooden panel along the eastern wall, carved with elaborate Rococo scrolls. "Watson, if you would." I approached and pushed against the edge. A slight groan of hidden hinges rewarded us. Behind the panel, a narrow staircase wound upward. "He's not here," Penner said quickly. "It's just old servants' passages, goes nowhere." Holmes's smile was razor-thin. "Then you will not object to our inspection." With lantern in hand, we ascended. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of mildew and old paper thickening. At the top, we emerged into what appeared to be an abandoned nursery, dusty toys and decaying drapes. But Holmes moved to a side door, tapped thrice upon the frame, and then opened it slowly. Inside, dimly lit by a single candle, lay a figure stretched upon a chaise longue. His cheeks were sunken, his beard unshaved, and his right leg swaddled in linen. Yet even in this diminished state, Viscount Henry de Vries retained something of his imperious air. He looked up as Holmes entered. "I suppose you're here to judge me," he croaked. Holmes stepped closer. "That would require knowing precisely what you've done." De Vries let out a rattling breath. "I deciphered too much, that's all. The cipher, it's not merely treasure maps and Medici gossip. It names names, Mr. Holmes. Families who bought loyalty with blood. Some of those names are alive still through their heirs. Embarrassment would be the least of it." Watson knelt to check the man's pulse. "He's dehydrated. He hasn't eaten properly in days." "I was given laudanum," De Vries said faintly, "and told to be quiet. Claudine, she said it was for my safety." "Safety?" Holmes asked, voice cold. "She said others were coming, people who would not hesitate to kill to keep the cipher hidden. She took the completed sections and left me here." Holmes looked down at the man, then rose. "Watson, help him downstairs. We'll summon the authorities from the village. I have no doubt Lestrade will enjoy untangling this nest." As I guided De Vries down the stairs, Holmes lingered a moment at the hearth. He reached behind a tapestry and retrieved a leather satchel. Inside were several folded folios, each bearing the same looping script and ciphered markings we had seen in Villani's fragment. Holmes smiled grimly. She did not take everything. But as we returned to the study, Holmes's expression darkened. The older man, Penner, was gone. His chair empty, the door ajar. A trail of muddy footprints led into the hall. Holmes cursed softly. "The fox has slipped the snare." He turned to me, his eyes glittering. "But the game, Watson, the game is still very much afoot." We did not remain long at Rookhaven Manor after discovering Viscount de Vries. Holmes had summoned the local constable from Sudbury and left a detailed message for Inspector Lestrade, requesting that he take charge of the estate and any papers or persons of interest still within. Penner's flight and the knowledge that he had at least one accomplice in the Frenchwoman known only as Mademoiselle Claudine Vervin made it clear that the affair was no longer confined to Suffolk. Holmes, however, remained inscrutably composed during our return journey to London the next morning. He said little, except to remark on the poor quality of British coffee and to examine the recovered folios from the cipher with a small brass lens he kept tucked into his pocket-book. I knew better than to disturb him when he entered this state of lucid calculation, and so I passed the time with my journal, committing to paper the events of the previous night while they remained sharp in memory. At Liverpool Street Station, we were met not by Mrs. Hudson or the drayman from Baker Street, but by Signor Ernesto Villani, who stood stiffly near the baggage carts, his gloved hands gripping a folded umbrella with undue ferocity. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted with a slight bow. "Dr. Watson, I received your telegram this morning and came at once." Holmes nodded without preamble. "We have recovered part of the cipher, though not, I suspect, the most crucial section, and more importantly, we have located the man who originally received it, Viscount de Vries. He is safe for the moment." Villani exhaled sharply. You mean he was in danger? He was being held under the influence of laudanum in a locked nursery, if that counts, said Holmes dryly. He claims to have partially cracked the cipher and to have passed on the most sensitive portions to a woman known as Claudine Vervin. Are you familiar with her name? The librarian's eyes darkened. Vervain, he murmured. Yes, she is whispered about in certain bibliophile circles, especially those concerned with lost papal archives and forbidden manuscripts. They say she worked with Count Resi of Milan, and before him with an antiquities dealer in Trieste who was found poisoned in his bath. But she is elusive, like a shadow made flesh. She is also in London, said Holmes. Or will be, shortly. De Vries expected her here. I have a suspicion that she intends to auction or negotiate the remaining pages of the cipher to the highest bidder. You mean to say, I interjected, that she would try to sell not only a stolen manuscript, but one containing politically dangerous information. Holmes turned to me with a wry expression. My dear Watson, you do her a disservice. She's not trying to sell it. She is trying to decide who deserves to be ruined by it. That, after all, is far more profitable. We returned to Baker Street and found the sitting room as we had left it, though a telltale crease in the curtains and a faint depression in the armchair by the fireplace told Holmes more than it told me. We have had a visitor, he murmured. Sat there no more than an hour ago. Slight build, likely female, and she left behind the scent of cypress and sandalwood. He lifted a handkerchief from the mantel. And this, laced with cologne, of course, but no monogram, a deliberate omission. Holmes seated himself and extracted the cipher folios from the satchel. I have been thinking, Watson, he said after a moment, about this cipher. There is something oddly theatrical about the way it has been pursued. The original theft, its mysterious return, and the message warning, Villani. It all points not to panic, but to staging. We are dealing with an opponent who plays as much for symbolism as for results. You mean the cipher's theatrical because the woman behind it is? I asked. In part, but more than that, because she believes herself to be playing a grand game, one with historical stakes. Holmes took up the fragment De Vries had annotated, the note that had mentioned the missing bell symbol. Look here. This entry suggests that certain cipher characters were pictographic, music notes, astrological signs, and even architectural elements. It's not a conventional substitution cipher, nor is it purely numeric. It operates on multiple levels: language, culture, and symbolism. You're suggesting only someone with an eclectic knowledge base could even begin to decode it. Precisely. And therein lies the key. Villani, De Vries, even Vervain, all of them possess highly specialized knowledge in Renaissance cryptography. But if the cipher was originally created to hide politically volatile secrets, it would have been intended to resist even their efforts. Holmes stood and walked to the bookshelf. He retrieved a thin volume with a cracked spine and thumbed through it until he reached an engraving of an old Florentine chapel. There, he said, tapping the page. Note the bells. There are 3, each with a symbol etched in its bronze. 1 star, 1 eye, and 1 serpent. I leaned closer. You think this chapel is part of the key? I think the cipher's missing character for bell is not simply a sound, but a reference to a place, perhaps even to a specific event, something encoded by association rather than mere language. Villani stepped forward, now visibly intrigued. That engraving, he said, was done by Giulio dell'Arca, an apprentice of Giorgio Vasari. It depicts the Convento di Santa Beata, a monastery that was destroyed in a fire in 1592. All records were thought to be lost. Yet this cipher implies otherwise, Holmes said, which means Claudine Vervin's possession of the missing folios could point us to a historical site long erased from the map. There was a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a small parcel wrapped in butcher's paper. This came for you, Mr. Holmes. No return address. Holmes opened it carefully, revealing a single sheet of heavy vellum. On it was drawn the same ciphered script, but this time the writing formed a perfect circle, like a sundial. In the center, in clear ink, were 3 words in Latin: Per clangorem revelatur. Through the ringing shall it be revealed. Holmes translated aloud. It seems our adversary wishes to keep us chasing riddles. But why send you this? I asked. To test us, Holmes replied. To see if we are clever enough to follow. He examined the vellum with a lens, then turned it over. A small watermark in the corner, nearly invisible, read Hôtel Parnasse, Paris. Holmes stood abruptly. Watson, pack your case. Signor Villani, if you can secure diplomatic passage for these recovered pages, do so discreetly and lock them in the British Museum's rare manuscripts vault. I must pursue the remainder. The woman behind this cipher is no ordinary thief. She is an ideologue, and she believes herself the guardian of dangerous truth. And you? I asked. He looked at me with that glint I had come to know so well, the thrill of the chase, the joy of intellect in pursuit. I intend, he said, to catch the flame before it burns the past and the present with it. The Hôtel Parnasse stood on the Rue du Soleil, a quiet street tucked away from the bustle of the Parisian left bank, its cream-colored facade half obscured by climbing ivy and its entrance shaded by a striped awning. Beneath the outward charm of the establishment, however, Holmes sensed something colder, something watchful. It was the sort of place frequented not by tourists or merchants, but by archivists, antiquaries, and those for whom discretion was not just desired, but required. We arrived on the morning train from Calais, our luggage modest and our appearances carefully unremarkable. Holmes had adopted a slightly theatrical walking stick and affected a faint limp. An old trick, Watson, he told me with a smirk. One that inspires pity, not suspicion. The concierge at the Parnasse was a pale man with a waxed mustache and an accent that hovered somewhere between Lyon and Brussels. He barely glanced up when Holmes handed him the card of Monsieur Henri Marceau, Professor of Ancient Paleography, Cambridge. Whether the alias was believed or merely tolerated, the man nodded and gestured to the brass lift at the rear. Room 206 was small but immaculately arranged, with heavy curtains that kept the morning sun at bay and a writing desk set against the far wall. Holmes swept the space quickly with his gaze, then checked the drawer of the nightstand and the underside of the writing desk. He found nothing of immediate interest. She was here, he said softly. Recently. The scent is faint now, but it's the same blend. Cypress, sandalwood, and bergamot. Not commercial. Likely a private blend from a perfumer. I shall inquire at Guerlain tomorrow. You think she's still in Paris? I asked, peering through the window onto the quiet street below. I'd stake a Florentine ducat on it. The cipher pages are too valuable to move without a buyer in place. And this city, he paused, this city is her chessboard. Holmes turned his attention to the guest ledger, which he'd borrowed with a generous tip to the concierge. He scanned the last 2 weeks of entries, frowning at several ambiguous initials and blank check-in lines. Here, an entry for a C. Verity, 4 days ago, room 309. No checkout, noted. An alias, no doubt. We must tread delicately, Watson. She has eyes. And indeed, we began to sense them. Over the course of the next 2 days, as we moved from libraries to antiquities dealers, and finally to the reading room of the Institut de France, Holmes noted the recurrence of a thin man with a limp, a woman in gloves too thick for the weather, and a street violinist who always seemed to linger at our cafe. But the breakthrough came not from Holmes's usual tricks of disguise and deduction, but from a subtle detail that no other man would have noticed, save for him. We had spent the afternoon at a second-hand map shop along the Rue des Écoles, speaking to an elderly cartographer who specialized in pre-Renaissance Italy. Holmes had engaged him in conversation about 16th century Florentine bell towers, a conversation that had drawn the attention of another patron pretending to browse charts of maritime routes. The man left abruptly. Holmes smiled. Now we shall see the shape of the spider's web. That evening, under cover of rain and the dull echo of distant church bells, we returned to the Hotel Parnasse. Holmes was unusually silent on the climb up the back stairwell, his features drawn taut with something more than mere anticipation. There was calculation there, yes, but also a thin undercurrent of something colder. Resentment, perhaps, or memory. Room 309 lay at the end of the third-floor corridor, its door unassuming and unmarked. Holmes removed a narrow sliver of metal from his cuff and had the lock turned in under 10 seconds. The room was dim. A single oil lamp on the dresser burned low. Papers were scattered across the bed, and on the small desk beside the curtained window lay an open folio, the same stylized script, unmistakably part of the Florentine cipher. And standing beside it, poised like a dancer who knows her curtain is about to fall, was a woman. She was slender, her dark hair pulled back into a severe knot, and she wore a dress the color of old wine. There was nothing overtly theatrical about her, yet she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of one accustomed to being both admired and feared. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, fixed first on Holmes and then on me. "So," she said softly, "he comes at last." "Claudine Vervin," Holmes said, his tone dry but controlled. "You speak it as though it were an accusation. Only insofar as a name can be its own confession." She smiled and gestured to the folio. "You may take it if you like. That piece has served its purpose." Watson stepped forward. "You mean to say—" Holmes raised a hand to stop me. "You know what's encoded in the pages, don't you?" he asked. "I know what men believe is encoded," she said, "and that is power enough. Whether the secrets are true or invented, the fear they inspire is real. A whisper of treason, a suggestion of sacrilege, and the old. Families begin to sweat. You've already begun to sell," Holmes deduced. "To hint, to test." "Not for gold," she said, approaching the window. "For balance, for penance, perhaps." The Medici hoarded knowledge as power, hid their crimes beneath layers of ink and illusion. Why should that past remain buried? "Because history should be preserved, not weaponized," Holmes said evenly. "Tell that to those whose families still hold influence because of that blood-stained history," she countered. A silence settled. The rain ticked against the window panes. Holmes regarded her for a long moment. "You're not just a collector," he said at last. "You're an architect. You've constructed this entire game. Moved the cipher from Florence to Naples to London and finally to Paris. You let it be found, let it be stolen, and ensured it would pass through precisely the hands you needed, Villani, De Vries, and now me." Her smile deepened. "And yet you came." Holmes stepped toward the desk and gently closed the folio. "What remains?" She tilted her head. "The bell. Always the bell. When it rings, the final truth will be spoken." Holmes's brow furrowed. "Is it a code, or an event?" Claudine Vervin did not answer. Instead, she turned to the window and lifted the curtain. Across the city, the evening fog had settled like a veil. But one tower, black against the moonlight, stood illuminated by a gas lamp at its base. She pointed. "Notre-Dame de l'Espoir," she said. "It was once a monastery before it burned in 1794. But the bell remains. They say it tolls only when the truth demands to be heard." Holmes's gaze followed hers. "Tomorrow," she said, "at dusk." "Why?" he asked softly. Her eyes met his, and something passed between them, something unspoken, born of intellect and equal cunning. "Because I tire of secrets," she said, "even those of my own making." And then, before either of us could react, She stepped backward through the window, a narrow ledge beyond it, and disappeared into the night's mist, her form vanishing like smoke along the rooftop's edge. I rushed to the window, but there was no sign of her. Only the rain, the rooftops, and the silent bell tower beyond. Holmes remained motionless beside the desk. "She's not done," he said. "No," I agreed, "but she's chosen the time and place." Holmes nodded slowly. "And we shall be there when the bell rings." The day of the bell's reckoning dawned wet and slow, Paris draped in a sheet of grey mist that hung like cobwebs over her ancient rooftops. Holmes and I rose before the sun and took breakfast in near silence at a small café on the Rue Saint-Jacques. He was especially quiet that morning, sipping absently at a bitter black coffee as he stared into the middle distance, eyes distant yet keenly alert. "You haven't slept," I remarked, noting the dark hollows beneath his eyes. Holmes stirred. "No, Watson. Sleep is for those at peace with ambiguity. I, on the other hand, have spent the night in the company of riddles, particularly one shaped like a bell." He removed from his coat a small sheet of paper on which he had drawn a crude sketch of the old church tower Claudine Vervin had pointed to the night before. The structure, Notre-Dame de l'Espoir, was little more than a historical ghost in the minds of most Parisians. Few remembered its former life as a Carmelite monastery. Fewer still were aware of the events that had transpired there during the Reign of Terror. Holmes tapped the drawing with a long finger. "This bell, when it rings, the final truth will be spoken," she said. That was not mere metaphor, Watson. The phrase per clangorem revelatur appears repeatedly in the Cipher. It was the motto of a secret order within the Medici court, a kind of internal tribunal whose members preserved damning secrets by encoding them in the margins of religious texts. Each major betrayal, execution, or asset transfer was sealed by the tolling of a specific bell, symbolic, and more. It was a signal to those within the circle, a final act of authorization. The last toll was said to accompany the loss of a hidden archive, smuggled out of Florence during the siege of 1530. You think that archive is what Claudine Vervin is hunting? I think she already has it, or part of it. The Cipher's fragmented phrases, the references to serpent blood and burned tongues. These aren't merely poetic flourishes. They're encoded indexes. She's been reconstructing the location of a secret vault or reliquary. Hidden in the church, Holmes gave a grim smile. Precisely. By noon, we had secured access to Notre-Dame de l'Espoir through a contact Holmes maintained at the Paris Prefecture. A narrow man named Etienne Renaud, whose taste for antiquities was only rivaled by his appetite for scandal. Renaud had arranged for us to be admitted under the guise of ecclesiastical scholars preparing a monograph on abandoned Gothic chapels. The church stood at the edge of the Marais, hemmed in by crumbling tenements and disused shops. Its stonework was blackened with soot, its bell tower stark against the washed-out sky. Though long since deconsecrated, the building retained its solemn air. Inside, the nave was a hollow vault, the pews long removed, the altar covered in a thick cloth. Fragments of stained glass clung to high lancet windows, casting fractured patterns upon the dusty flagstones. Holmes moved with measured precision, inspecting the walls and the bases of columns with a magnifying glass. I assisted where I could, though most of the marks appeared to me to be nothing more than the wear of centuries. "The bell," Holmes murmured, gazing up at the belfry above. It was cast in Florence, smuggled to Paris under the patronage of Catherine de' Medici, an echo of power transferred. If she meant her final message to be heard, it will be through that bell. He turned sharply to Renaud. "Is the bell functional?" Renaud nodded. "It has not rung in decades, but structurally, yes. The mechanism is intact, and there is a manual rope pulley." "Then we shall ring it." Holmes ascended the narrow stone stairwell that coiled through the tower like a spine. I followed, the lantern in my hand casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air grew colder the higher we climbed, and dust stirred beneath our feet like the breath of the past. At the summit, the bell loomed overhead, a massive bronze form etched with Latin and Florentine insignias. Its clapper hung still, as if waiting for a sentence long overdue. Holmes examined the base of the pulley system, tracing the worn wooden beams and inspecting the anchor bolt. "Watson," he said, "tie the lantern to the bell frame. I need light on the southern arch." I did so, and he crouched beneath the rim. There, nearly invisible beneath a layer of grime, was a carved panel with symbols that mirrored those from the cipher pages. A serpent, a crescent moon, and a bell with 3 concentric rings. "It's a lock," he whispered, "or rather, a release." He produced a stylus and began to trace the lines of the carving. As he did so, I heard the low groan of internal gears shifting, ancient mechanisms long dormant, awakening like buried memories. A section of the floor beneath the bell trembled, then opened with a soft hiss. Holmes motioned to me. Beneath us lay a small chamber no larger than a chapel vestry. It was constructed not of stone but of timber reinforced with iron, an unusual choice, likely to foil attempts at excavation. Inside, on a pedestal, lay a sealed coffer made of blackened wood and fastened with an ornate Florentine lock. Holmes descended first. I followed him down a rusted ladder, boots scraping on the iron rungs. The air was thick with old incense and something else, something musky and almost metallic. He examined the coffer closely, then smiled. "There is wax here, sealing wax, still intact. This was not meant to be opened lightly." I watched as he removed a narrow blade from his coat and inserted it under the latch. With a soft crack, the wax seal gave way. The coffer opened. Inside lay a series of vellum scrolls, tightly rolled and bound with ribbon, each bearing the insignia of the Medici crest. Alongside them was a narrow ledger bound in calfskin. Holmes opened it delicately. His eyes flicked across the pages. "It's a registry," he said. "Names, dates, payments, assassinations disguised as royal decrees. Look, here, 1527. Barberini, silenced for heresy, vault concealed at Belladonna Chapel, toll the bell 3 times. I drew a breath. "This is damning." Holmes nodded. "It is dynamite wrapped in parchment." And then, before we could speak further, the bell above us tolled. It rang with a sonorous, ancient force that seemed to shake the marrow in our bones. A second toll followed, and then a third. Holmes's face darkened. That was not us. We scrambled up the ladder, emerging once again into the tower as the third toll echoed through the city. Standing in the center of the bell chamber, framed against the cold blue sky, was Claudine Vervin. She did not look surprised. "So it was here all along," she said. Holmes straightened. "I suppose you were hoping to be alone." "I had hoped," she admitted, "but fate rarely grants such gifts. You've manipulated scholars, collectors, and aristocrats," Holmes said. "But in the end, you couldn't resist making a performance of it. The bell tolls, the secrets rise, and the past speaks through the stone." She nodded. It had to be heard. "But to what end?" I demanded. "What do you gain?" She looked at me then, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something behind her eyes, not ambition, but sorrow. "Justice," she said, "or what remains of it." And then she reached into her coat and drew a small object. A vial. Before we could react, she dashed it against the base of the bell. A puff of smoke erupted, thick, acrid, blinding. When it cleared, she was gone. Holmes rushed to the ledge. Below, a figure darted into the alleyway, swallowed by the Paris mist. "She had an escape planned," he said bitterly. But then his expression changed. "She wanted us to find the archive, Watson. She wanted the bell to toll. Now the question is, who else heard it? It was past midnight when Holmes and I returned to our rented rooms on the Rue de la Baie. Paris was beginning to settle into its nocturnal lull. The cafes had shuttered, the market carts had vanished from the boulevards, and the clatter of horses had given way to the hush of rainfall pattering against cobblestones. Yet inside our chamber, lit by a single flickering oil lamp, the air was crackling with unspoken tension. Holmes paced like a man wrestling with an invisible adversary. His coat was damp and his brow furrowed, but his eyes gleamed with relentless fire. On the desk before him lay the recovered vellum scrolls and the Medici ledger, arranged with the same reverence one might afford ancient scripture. I had scarcely removed my gloves before he broke the silence. "We've crossed a threshold, Watson," he said, voice tight. "The bell has rung. The message has been received." "You're referring to the archive?" I asked, settling into the high-backed chair near the window. "To the signal." He stopped pacing and turned sharply toward me. We must consider what that bell represented. Not just a historical flourish, but a ciphered declaration of activation. For centuries it was a means of silent acknowledgement among certain Medici loyalists, yes. But now it has tolled again, for the first time in over 400 years. "You believe there are those alive today who understand its meaning?" Holmes nodded grimly. "Not many, but enough. Claudine Vervin is no ordinary ideologue. Her reach extends beyond scholars and smugglers. She is entangled with individuals who walk the corridors of power, men and women whose reputations would not survive the revelations hidden in those scrolls." He tapped the Medici ledger with his finger. "This book names more than just couriers and spies. It implicates royal households, papal envoys, and banking dynasties whose bloodlines still influence Europe's elite." I leaned forward. "Then what's our next move? We can't simply publish the contents, not without starting an international scandal." "No, Watson. But we must understand the game being played, and that means tracing the signal." Holmes opened the folio once more and turned to the final page of the ledger. There, scrawled in ink of a darker hue, was a short list of symbols, each paired with a corresponding city: Firenze, Roma, Vienna, Geneva, and London. "Nodes," Holmes murmured. "Points of activation. These are not simply geographic references. They are contact points. Each one likely corresponds to a key holder, a descendant or proxy, still holding a fragment of the wider archive or knowledge of its function. And if they were watching for the bell, they know now that the archive has been disturbed." I stood and moved toward the desk, troubled. What of Vervin? She could be warning them, leveraging the material for power. "She already is," Holmes said. "But she does not want their silence. She wants their exposure. Her methods are theatrical, yes, but her motive remains philosophical. She believes in the ruin of these dynasties as a moral necessity, and she's orchestrating this operation like a campaign of ideological sabotage." "Do we even know who they are?" Holmes's reply was a silence heavy with calculation. After a long pause, he said, "Not yet. But we will." He turned abruptly and reached for the case in which he kept his traveling correspondence. He extracted a sealed envelope and handed it to me. "This was delivered while we were at the tower. No return address. But note the wax seal. See the emblem? A lion devouring a serpent." I examined it. "Florentine." "And yet," Holmes said, "also used by a discreet intelligence circle operating out of Geneva in the early 1800s. They were known as La Voix du Feu, the voice of fire. Scholars, financiers, and clerics who trafficked in suppressed knowledge. If Vervin is connected to them, the implications widen substantially." I opened the letter carefully. Inside was a single sheet bearing a message composed in block type. "If the bell tolls again, the serpent will wake. The fire will not choose its fuel. A witness to the archive." Beneath it, penciled in a lighter hand, were 2 words: Whitehall. Midnight. I looked to Holmes. "London," he nodded. The final node, or the next one to fall? But the warning, it implies retaliation. Not retaliation. Detonation, Holmes replied. Vervaine's plan may no longer be hers alone. Others, hidden players, may have decided that secrecy must now be preserved at any cost, including fire. He closed the ledger with a snap and stood. We must return to England immediately. There's a name missing from that list, a man whose absence is more revealing than his presence would be. Who? Holmes gave me a grim smile. Lord Marbury. I blinked. The Marbury who chairs the Royal Antiquities Committee? He's nearly 70. Precisely. And more to the point, he's been inexplicably quiet for the last fortnight. He was a known associate of De Vries and a long-time patron of Villani's archives. If anyone knows how deep the Cipher's reach extends into the present, it is he. We packed our cases swiftly, Holmes stopping only to dispatch a coded message through the telegraph office near the Seine. As we crossed the Channel the following evening, the sea seemed more unsettled than usual, and a strange tension hung in the air. Not merely atmospheric, but psychological, as if some great hand had stirred the waters of history and loosed something from the silt. Upon arrival in London, the city greeted us with its characteristic gloom, the fog clinging to the gas lamps like wet muslin. We made for Whitehall directly, our cab clattering through the misty streets toward the appointed meeting place. It was just before midnight when we arrived at the base of the old Admiralty Arch. A lone figure stood beneath one of the archways, wrapped in a thick overcoat and leaning on an ivory-handled cane. Holmes approached cautiously. Lord Marbury? The man turned. His face was pale and deeply lined, and though the years had carved hollows into his cheeks, his eyes retained the wary gleam of a man who had seen too much. Mr. Holmes, he said, and Dr. Watson, of course. I had hoped this meeting would not be necessary. But here we are, Holmes replied. Marbury gestured for us to follow, and we moved in silence into a small gated courtyard. There, beneath the skeletal branches of a bare oak, he spoke. You've stirred the serpent, Mr. Holmes. I felt its coils tightening for years. Claudine was not the beginning. She is the echo, a consequence. You know about the archive. I helped hide part of it, Marbury said, as did my father, and his before him. A pact, born in silence, justified by peace. Every century, a guardian, until now. What changed? Marbury looked toward the darkened Thames. Truth became louder than loyalty. Holmes's gaze sharpened. You received the signal? I heard the bell, he said, as did others. And what happens now? Marbury drew a slow breath. There are those who believe the ledger must be destroyed, that silence must be enforced, and they will not hesitate. And what do you believe? The old man's voice faltered. I believe we waited too long. That truth has a way of waking itself. You must understand, if the contents of that archive are revealed, it will not simply be embarrassment. It will be collapse, families undone, institutions disgraced, the past unshrouded. And in this city, he paused, the past is a foundation stone. Holmes nodded slowly. And what role shall you play in the days ahead? Marbury's face tightened. None. My part ends here, but yours does not. He handed Holmes a folded document, a list of names, all written in ciphered characters. The last key, he whispered. One more toll, and the world will hear what was never meant to be spoken. It was the sort of night London wears like a shroud, fog as thick as chimney soot, curling through alleys and lamplight with the sluggish determination of a creeping tide. After our cryptic meeting beneath Admiralty Arch, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in silence, Lord Marbury's document folded tightly inside the breast pocket of Holmes's coat. Neither of us spoke until the fire in our sitting room had been stoked and the last echo of cab wheels had faded into the smoky dark. Holmes laid the document on the desk with great care. It was smaller than I'd expected. Just one sheet, thick vellum stained with age, folded thrice and sealed with a smear of wax so worn it had become no more than a flaking shadow. Upon unfolding it, we found a list, not of names as one might expect, but of symbols. Each line bore a strange ideogram, followed by what appeared to be a date, and beside it, a series of initials. There were 21 such entries in all. Holmes's eyes scanned the page with almost mechanical intensity. "This," he murmured, "is not a list of names in the conventional sense. It's a ledger of code names, symbols assigned to identities, and these," he pointed to the adjacent columns, "are reference keys, likely cross-indexed with the Medici ledger. You think these initials are the modern bearers of the secrets?" Holmes gave a slow nod. "Or descendants of the original keepers, custodians of knowledge so volatile it required cloaking even from each other. Note the structure. 4 glyphs resemble the Florentine cipher forms we've seen. The rest use variations, suggesting evolution of the code across generations. But this," he tapped a peculiar entry near the bottom, a symbol shaped like an inverted cross surrounded by 4 stars. "This one I've seen before." He rose and strode to the bookcase. From among the crowded shelves he extracted a thick, dust-covered monograph, Heraldic Emblems and Secret Societies of Post-Renaissance Europe. Flipping through the pages with dexterity born of obsession, he stopped at an illustration depicting the very same glyph. "The Order of the Starless Communion," he read aloud. "A secretive guild of archivists and intermediaries, active from 1600 to approximately 1785. Believed to have been absorbed into the papal intelligence apparatus during the reign of Clement XIV. Notable for their use of non-verbal sigils to denote trust, rank, and truth restrictions. Rarely seen outside Vatican transactions." I stared at the illustration. "Then if the same symbol appears here, it means someone from that order, or their legacy, is involved in the cipher's modern web." "Precisely," Holmes said. "This goes far deeper than Vervaine's vendetta or De Vries's obsession with provenance. We are dealing with the remains of an information cartel, a council of silence hidden behind centuries of misdirection." I took a breath. And now the veil is lifting. Holmes moved again to the window, watching as the fog swirled over Baker Street like a restless spirit. "We must identify one of these initials. Just one. That will begin to untangle the chain." He turned and took up a second sheet of notes. His own transcriptions from the Medici ledger retrieved from the hidden chamber in the Paris bell tower. "This," he said, pointing to one of the later entries, "details a transaction between a custode del fuoco and a recipient codenamed E.S. London 1862. That is within living memory." "Could be a relation of someone on the current list," I offered. "Exactly. And there are only 3 entries on this new document with the same location marker. Of those, one uses the initials E.S. He paused. "Watson, how many men of wealth and influence with the initials E.S. resided in London in 1862? I thought for a moment. "There was Edward Strangbourne, the shipping magnate, died bankrupt in 73. Edwin Sutcliffe, an art collector who perished in a suspicious fire at his Surrey estate. And," I hesitated, "Elijah Sterling," Holmes said, finishing the list. "Yes, a name buried quietly by time, an unassuming antiquarian, rarely seen in public, but if memory serves, his residence was an annex beneath St. James's Chapel, converted from an older crypt, precisely the sort of place a man might keep dangerous things. And his descendants? One son, drowned in youth. No direct heirs. The property passed to a religious trust, but the crypt has remained closed to the public for decades." Holmes paced for a moment, then came to a halt before the hearth. "We must go there, Watson." "To the crypt?" "Yes. I believe the key to this mystery, perhaps the final confirmation of what the archive truly contains, lies in the chamber once held by Elijah Sterling. If the sigils and codes are to be trusted, he was London's guardian. The bell has rung. If anything remains, it will be there. We arrived at St. James's Chapel just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The chapel itself was quiet, its modest nave attended by only 2 elderly parishioners and a clergyman sweeping rainwater from the vestibule tiles. Holmes approached with polite gravity, introducing himself as a scholar of ecclesiastical history, researching the private vaults of London's sacred spaces. The vicar, a short man named Reeves with trembling hands and a kindly disposition, offered hesitant approval. "The crypt below is mostly sealed," he said. "It was used long ago for burials during the cholera epidemic. No one stepped down there in years." "Then we shall be the first to knock on its bones," Holmes replied. "May I trouble you for the keys?" The vicar, somewhat bewildered but taken in by Holmes's authoritative tone, led us to a side door near the apse and handed over a ring of ancient, rust-spotted keys. The descent was narrow, the air growing colder with each stone step. At the bottom, we emerged into a low, vaulted corridor, lit only by our lanterns. The walls were lined with faded plaques and iron doors. One bore the name Sterling, barely legible through the grime. Holmes inserted the key and turned it slowly. The lock gave way with a groan that echoed into the damp hollow. Inside was a chamber of surprising elegance. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, though the volumes were now warped with age. A desk stood at the far end, its surface shrouded in a film of dust, and above it an icon, a crucifix entwined with the Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail. Holmes exhaled slowly. He was not merely a guardian. He was an adherent. "To what?" I asked. Holmes stepped forward and opened a cabinet behind the desk. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, was a thick tome. He placed it on the desk and undid the bindings. The book opened to reveal a series of parchment sheets, each inscribed with ciphered text and intricate marginalia. But the final pages were different. Plain English, written in a precise, almost trembling hand. Holmes read aloud, "To the one who finds this, know that knowledge without mercy is a sword that cuts all ways." The truths I kept were never mine to reveal, but their existence is now a burden too great to bear. Should the bell toll again, understand this: there will be no return to silence. The names must fall, or they shall rise in fire. He looked up. "This is a confession, Watson, and a warning." I moved closer, reading the lines again. Then the bell was meant not as a signal to reclaim, but to unleash. Holmes nodded. "Claudine Vervin has made her move. We now hold a piece of the arsenal she hoped would start a reckoning. But what remains unclear is who else heard the bell." I finished. Holmes closed the book gently and looked toward the sealed iron door. "And how far they're willing to go to silence it again." The next morning began not with breakfast, but with an explosion. We were no more than a few steps from Baker Street. Holmes had insisted we retrieve certain notes and cipher fragments before deciding how best to secure the Sterling volume, when the blast tore through the dawn. It was muffled, but unmistakable, a blunt, percussive roar, followed by the far-off cries of alarm, echoing up through the alleyways of Marylebone. Holmes froze mid-stride. "That came from the direction of Duke's Mews," he said sharply. "The church records repository." We ran without further discussion. A block east, past the quiet doors of the medical college and beneath the arch of New Cavendish Street, smoke now curled lazily into the pale sky. A crowd had begun to gather outside the heavy oak doors of the chapter house, home to one of London's oldest ecclesiastical archives. The doors were scorched, one hanging half off its hinges. Ash clung to the wet cobbles. The smell of burning paper hung in the air. Holmes flashed his card and shouldered through the cordon of constables. Inside, the great hall had been ravaged. Rows of ancient ledgers, manuscripts, ecclesial maps, and baptismal registries had collapsed in on themselves, blackened skeletons of parchment still smouldering. The fire brigade was dousing the far wall, but it was clear that the damage had been done. Inspector Lestrade appeared from the smoke, coughing and waving away a firefighter's concern. "Holmes," he called, voice raw. "I wondered if you'd beat me to it." Holmes moved to his side at once. "Any casualties?" "One clerk. Taken out before the worst of it. Lucky, if you ask me." Holmes was already scanning the scorched floor with sharp eyes. "And the building?" "Intentional," Lestrade said. "Someone forced the lock, went straight to the lower archive room and poured accelerant, a precise job." Holmes crouched beside what had once been a set of drawers. "Do we know what was kept here?" Lestrade rubbed his brow. "Mostly ecclesiastical charter copies, private donations, forgotten family records. Nothing of value to the casual thief." "To the casual thief," Holmes echoed. "But to someone searching for alternate custodians of a Medici cipher, perhaps a terminal lead." He stood. This was not arson to cover a theft. This was a purge. I stepped closer. "You believe they were erasing names? Or locations? Or proof of hidden archives like Sterling's? If the bell toll was truly a call to war among the Guardians, then this," he gestured to the destruction, "is the first retaliation." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "You think it's connected to that cipher business in Paris?" Holmes gave a brief nod. "More than connected. We are watching the fuse curl toward the powder." We spent the next 2 hours assisting Lestrade in cataloguing the names of the burned registries, noting that several entries listed in Lord Marbury's document correlated to families whose records were now ash. One such name, Albertoni, was among those Holmes had circled the night before. "They are wiping the trail," Holmes muttered. "Not just the truth, but its scaffolding." When we finally returned to Baker Street, Holmes went at once to the fireplace. He removed from beneath the floorboard a slender envelope containing Villani's original fragment of the cipher, the one that had begun the entire affair. "I had a terrible thought, Watson," he said, unfolding it. "We have been assuming Vervain is our prime mover, the one sending the bell's toll across Europe like a flame through dry fields. But what if she was not the bell ringer?" "You think she's a pawn?" I asked. "Number A catalyst. She uncovered what others feared to touch. But once she pulled the veil, others moved. Quiet ones, ones with far more to lose." He laid the cipher beside the ledger recovered from Sterling's crypt. "These documents are now targets. Whoever holds them is in danger." A knock interrupted our thoughts. It was Signor Villani. He looked exhausted. His coat was soaked with London drizzle, and his gloves clutched a leather satchel as if it were a relic. "Mr. Holmes," he said breathlessly, "I've come straight from the museum vault. The Ashmolean has received a communiqué. A coded letter, unsigned but bearing a Vatican watermark. They believe it concerns the cipher. I have it here." Holmes opened the satchel and unfolded the sheet. The text was brief. "If the seal is broken and the bell has rung, London's silence must be restored. The order does not forget. The chamber beneath the lion's head must remain closed. The fourth name is compromised." "The chamber beneath the lion's head," Holmes repeated. "What on earth?" Villani stepped forward. "I have a theory. There is a subterranean vault beneath the British Library, older than the building itself. It predates Bloomsbury's grid. Some say it was once part of a Roman storehouse. Over the arch is carved a lion's head in stone. I believe that is the chamber." "Is it accessible?" Villani nodded. "If you have clearance from the Special Archives Division, which I happen to possess." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then we must go tonight." The British Library at Bloomsbury had long been more than a home for books. Its basements extended like catacombs beneath the surface of London, sealed chambers and forgotten rooms interwoven with the history of empires and erasures alike. Villani led us down 2 flights of stone stairs, past reading rooms lit with gas lamps and iron vaults locked tight behind brass handles. At last we came to a narrow corridor, its bricks ancient, unmarked. At the far end, etched above an iron door, was a stone carving. A lion's head, tongue curled, eyes hollow and deep. Villani produced a brass key and unlocked the door. Inside was a circular room lined with cases of glass. Dust lay thick upon the floor, but the air was not stale. Someone had been here recently. Holmes moved immediately to the far wall. There, amid fragments of scrolls and charred manuscript leaves, stood an open cabinet. Its contents were gone, but on the wall beside it was a message, freshly painted in red ink. "The fourth name has fallen." Watson exhaled. "They're striking down the custodians." Holmes nodded. "And they are accelerating. Whoever holds the fourth name, he is dead. And if our information is correct..." He paused. "The fifth name is Lord Marbury." Suddenly the urgency snapped into place. Holmes turned to Villani. "You must return to the museum. Guard what remains. Do not trust anyone, not even your superiors. Watson, we go to Marbury's residence at once." Marbury's townhouse in Belgravia stood shrouded in fog, its windows shuttered, a single gas lamp lit on the iron gate. We rang twice before the door opened. Not by a servant, but by Marbury himself. He looked older than he had the night before, drained, drawn, and somehow expectant. "You've come," he said softly. Holmes stepped inside. "You're in danger, my lord." "I know. Then why remain here?" Marbury sighed. "Because I have already chosen my end." He gestured us inside. We followed him through a dim corridor lined with portraits and into a library ablaze with candles. There, on the table, lay a single sheet of paper, his confession. "I was the fourth name," he said. "Not the fifth." Holmes paled. "Then who?" "Yourself," Marbury said, looking Holmes in the eye. "You're the fifth." A beat of stunned silence followed. "That's not possible," I said, stunned. "Holmes has no connection to this order." Marbury shook his head. "No connection by choice, but by inheritance. Your grandfather, Mr. Holmes, he was once entrusted with a portion of the cipher. He refused to pass it on, but bloodlines, it seems, are not so easily ignored." Holmes stepped back as if struck. "And now," Marbury added, "you must decide." The scrolls, the cipher, the bell. It is all pointing toward the end of secrecy, but its cost may be greater than you imagine. Holmes was silent. Then, slowly, he stepped toward the fireplace, his face grave. "The game is no longer about truth," he said. "It is about what survives in its wake." The fire in Lord Marbury's study crackled behind the heavy grate, its amber glow casting restless shadows across the bookshelves and wood-paneled walls. Outside, the streets of Belgravia lay muffled beneath a heavy fog, and the gas lamps flared like watchful eyes in the gloom. Inside the room, however, the air felt thick, with something weightier than fog, something unspoken and ancient. Destiny, perhaps, or its ghost. Holmes stood motionless at the hearth, his back to us, his silhouette dark against the firelight. Lord Marbury's revelation hung between us like a bell tolling in silence. That Holmes, through blood and inheritance, was the fifth name, the final custodian. And with that knowledge, the danger had passed from the theoretical to the inevitable. I watched my friend carefully. I had known Holmes for many years, through bullets and betrayals, across fog-bound moors and through the labyrinthine minds of murderers. But in that moment, I saw something I had never seen before. A man confronting not his enemy, but his own legacy. "It can't be," I said softly, more to myself than anyone else. "Holmes has no association with these orders. His grandfather, yes, a man of letters, of wide connection, but never a conspirator." Holmes turned slowly. "My grandfather, Erasmus Holmes, was many things," he said, his voice low. He had an appetite for languages, an unshakable belief in rationalism, and a curiosity that was both expansive and dangerous. He was also estranged from my father, something I never understood fully. Until now. He moved to Marbury's desk and opened the drawer. Inside lay a small iron box with a Medici sigil engraved upon it, the serpent and the key. Holmes examined it but did not touch it. "I recall a letter," he murmured, "sent to my father shortly after Erasmus died. My father burned it unread. I remember the seal, the serpent looped around a chalice. I had thought it the mark of a bookseller, so now I know otherwise." Lord Marbury was seated by the window, his hands folded, his face drawn with exhaustion. "You were always the final contingency," he said. "Erasmus was instructed never to pass it on, but when the others began to fall, it was clear the old circle would not survive. You were born into the line, Mr. Holmes, whether you claim it or not." Holmes gave a tight nod. "And what does that make me now?" Marbury looked up. "A choice." We were silent for a moment. Then Holmes stepped forward and opened the iron box. Inside was a manuscript unlike any I'd ever seen. It was bound in calfskin so worn it had taken on the sheen of polished stone. The first page bore no title, only a single phrase written in red ink. Veritas Ultima, the final truth. Beneath it, a list of names. Some we had seen in the Medici ledger, others unknown. Each was annotated with a mark, some struck through, others circled. Holmes turned the pages slowly, reverently. Maps, glyphs, passages in Latin and Old Tuscan, transcriptions of confessions, and notations in marginalia inked in multiple hands. And then a page of modern English. "If the fifth name is called upon, it shall be not for secrecy, but for reckoning. If the fire spreads, he must decide. Preserve or purge. There is no sixth name." Holmes closed the book with a breath. He looked to Marbury. "Was this your plan all along? To wait for me to inherit this burden?" Marbury's reply was quiet. "I did not want this. None of us did. But you are the last man I would trust to choose wisely." Holmes turned back to the fireplace. "You do realize this may already be beyond choice?" Marbury nodded. "Then prepare, because the others will not wait for you to decide." That night, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street under escort from two of Lestrade's men. Word of the fire at the chapter house had spread, but no arrests had been made. Villani remained at the British Museum, guarding the cipher fragments like a priest beside forbidden scripture. Meanwhile, Holmes worked like a man possessed. He drafted letters to contacts in Vienna, to curators in Rome, to informants in Geneva. He studied the sterling volume, the ledger, and the manuscript from Marbury's box with a precision that seemed to fracture time. I offered assistance where I could, but he had retreated into a mind palace more fortified than any cathedral. Finally, on the third night, he looked up from his desk and said, "I have reached a conclusion." I sat forward at once. "Go on." "The cipher," he said, "is not a key to treasure, nor simply to secrets. It is a map, across time, a chronicle of suppressions, of betrayals cloaked in ecclesiastical robes, of families made and unmade through clandestine knowledge. But more than that, it is a mirror." He held up the manuscript. "This book does not merely preserve history. It indicts it, and now it rests in my hands, as judge, jury, and perhaps executioner." I swallowed. "What will you do with it?" Holmes considered for a long moment. "There are two paths," he said. "One, I destroy the documents, every scroll, every page, and with it the possibility of any future exposure. The other, I reveal them all, names, details, and consequences be damned." "And the cost?" He leaned back. "In the first path, history remains as it was written by victors, but we preserve stability. The second path creates chaos, but offers the cleansing fire Claudine Vervin so desires." "And where is she now?" I asked. Holmes's expression hardened. "Moving. I believe she's in Vienna, or en route there." Her last encoded message was intercepted by one of my contacts. It referenced the Silberkreis, a clandestine chamber beneath the Hofburg Palace used by certain Habsburg advisors centuries ago. "If she's there, she's preparing a final blow." "To force your hand," I said. "Exactly. I must go to her." I stood, heart sinking. "Holmes, you cannot follow her into every fire." He placed a hand on my shoulder. "This time, Watson, I must. If I do not meet her at the end of this road, she will light the world on fire to make her truth heard. And what, if she's right?" Holmes met my eyes. "Then we burn it together." 3 days later, Holmes departed for Vienna. I remained in London, entrusted with copies of the Cipher, hidden scrolls, and the instructions for what must be done should Holmes not return. My heart was heavy, my sleep fractured, and the silence of Baker Street seemed suddenly cavernous. The last telegram I received read, "Arrived safely. Midnight meeting beneath Hofburg Vault. If bell tolls again, you'll know the answer." Shach. I kept vigil that night with the manuscript open before me. The fire flickered low, casting distorted shadows across the words of men long buried. And far off, or perhaps only in the mind, I thought I heard it. The deep, echoing toll of a bell that had not rung in centuries. The first word of Holmes came at dawn. It arrived in the form of a telegram, its paper creased and damp with condensation, the ink blurred slightly by haste and transit. The message was brief but unmistakably in his hand. "Met with her. Vault confirmed. No time for delay. Keep the scroll sealed. Await the bell. Ch." It was dated from Vienna and marked only hours after the time Holmes had estimated his entry beneath the Hofburg Palace. I read and reread it by the gaslight of Baker Street's parlor, the same lamp whose orange flicker had so often cast long shadows on Holmes's violin case or illuminated the fraying edges of the Persian slipper in which he kept his tobacco. But this time, the house was still, the slipper was undisturbed, and Holmes was somewhere beneath the stone belly of a foreign palace, engaged in a final reckoning with the woman who had lit the fuse on this entire affair. I had stayed behind in London not out of reluctance, but at Holmes' insistence. "Your role now, Watson," he had said, "is not as chronicler, but as steward. If this story ends in silence, you must decide how the silence is remembered. If it ends in fire, you must contain the blaze." And so I waited, but I waited with unease. At noon that day, Signor Ernesto Villani arrived at Baker Street bearing news of his own. "They have moved," he said without preamble. A group of men entered the manuscript vault at the Ashmolean this morning under the guise of museum authority. But they were not from the museum. The director denies any such orders. They knew exactly what they were looking for. "The Cipher?" I asked, rising. Villani shook his head. "They left it, but they destroyed everything else around it. Reference materials, index files, glossaries. They are isolating the Cipher, severing its context. Without those texts, even an expert would struggle to trace its origins." Holmes' prediction had come true. Someone was tidying history. I handed Villani the telegram. He read it with narrowed eyes. "Then it is tonight," he said. "If the bell tolls again, the truth will be unburied." That same night, I received a second communication. This time, not a telegram, but a letter slipped under the front door of 221B. A pale cream envelope bearing no postmark, sealed in wax with the same crest Holmes and I had seen above the Stirling chamber, the lion devouring the serpent. Inside, a single line. "If he rings the bell, the fire is yours to hold." No name. No signature. But I understood. And far to the east, in a city built on dynasties and marble, the bell waited. In Vienna, beneath the Hofburg Palace, A narrow staircase spirals into a vault so old even the archivists disagree on who built it. Some claim it predates the Habsburgs. Others say it was commissioned by Rudolph II himself, the emperor obsessed with alchemy and secrets. At the bottom of the stair, flanked by sconces long extinguished, is a chamber shaped like a hexagon. Its walls are fitted with wooden cabinets, their drawers bearing no labels. In the center, suspended by ancient ironwork, is the bell. It is small, no larger than a child's head, and cast not in bronze, but in an unusual alloy of tin and silver. It bears no inscription, no mark of origin, yet its ring, they say, can be heard even through walls. Holmes stood beneath it now, facing Claudine Vervin. She was dressed in grey, her hair bound in a braid that fell like a cord of ink down her back. She looked older than when we had seen her in Paris, more gaunt, more resolute. The bell hung between them like a verdict yet to be passed. "You made your choice," she said. "No," Holmes replied. "I came to understand yours." "And do you?" "I believe you once sought justice, but now you seek judgment." She paced slowly, her boots echoing against the stone floor. "History," she said, "has been written by liars in robes and crowns. The cipher exposes their lies. You've seen it, the confessions, the archives of suppression. We hold in our hands the receipts of centuries. And what do you wish to do with them?" "Release them." Holmes stepped forward. "To whom?" "To everyone." He frowned. "You would have every power in Europe dismantled. I would have it reborn, not on inherited bloodlines or backroom pacts, but on truth." Holmes studied her. "And you believe that truth is enough to rebuild a world?" "I believe," she said, "that only fire can sterilize rot." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Holmes removed from his coat a small object, the manuscript from Lord Marbury's box. He laid it gently beneath the bell. "The fifth name," she whispered. "I do not deny my inheritance," he said, "but I do not consent to it blindly." Claudine approached. "Then ring it. Signal the purge. Let the world hear." Holmes looked up at the bell. It had no rope. To ring it, one had to strike it by hand. He raised his arm, but did not move. Instead, he asked, "And what of those who know nothing of these sins? The children of the names, the innocent whose lives will be ruined because their blood once touched a seal?" Claudine's expression did not change. "They will adapt. History is not algebra," Holmes said. "You cannot balance it by subtraction alone." She stepped back. "So you'll do nothing?" "No," he replied. "I will do something different." He reached into his coat and removed a vial, clear glass, filled with a pale blue powder. Claudine's eyes narrowed. "Greek fire," he said. "Harmless when dry, unstoppable when wet." He placed it gently beside the manuscript. "If I strike the bell, I release the ledger to the world. But if I destroy it, I preserve a lie." She said nothing. "So I shall do neither," Holmes said. He stepped forward, took the manuscript and placed it in a steel case wrapped in oilcloth. "This shall be sealed, hidden where no one will find it. Not you, not I. The cipher will remain incomplete." "You cannot unring a bell," Claudine said, "but I can keep it from being struck." And with that, Holmes turned and walked toward the stair. She did not follow. 3 days later, I met Holmes at Charing Cross Station. He looked tired, but not defeated. I said nothing. Neither did he. Back at Baker Street, he handed me a letter. "For Villani," he said. "He will deposit it in the Vatican archive under the clause of sealed pontifical review." "And the scrolls?" "In the crypt at St. James's," he said. "Hidden under lock only I can unmake, and I shall forget how." I nodded. "And Vervain?" "She returned to Florence. To begin again." "Perhaps." Holmes sat in his armchair and took up his violin. The notes were low, aching, like the echo of a toll long faded. And I, for once, did not write, because some truths are not meant for ink, only for memory. It was some weeks later, well after the final embers of the affair had faded into grey ash, when I found Holmes once more seated at the window of our Baker Street lodgings, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression remote. Outside, London wheezed and clattered with its customary urgency, the clanging of hansoms and the whistle of steam punctuating the air, yet within our rooms all was still. The fog, pale and steady, licked at the panes like a cat returning to a familiar perch. Holmes had not spoken of Vienna since his return. Not once. No mention of the manuscript, or the bell beneath the Hofburg, or the compromise he had struck between history and its executioners. Nor had I pressed him, though I confess my fingers had hovered more than once over my pen, compelled by the instinct to document what I suspected was his most consequential case, and perhaps his most burdensome silence. That morning, however, something had shifted. A letter lay open on the table. Not written in code, nor marked with obscure symbols, but penned in elegant French on ivory paper. "She has gone to ground," Holmes said suddenly, as if continuing a thought we had never begun aloud. "Claudine?" I asked, lowering my paper. He nodded once. "The letter is from a friend in Florence. She's taken up residence in the monastery of San Michele a Montorio, abandoned technically, but partially restored by private funds. She is using her mother's name, teaching music to orphaned girls." "A fitting epilogue," I offered. Holmes did not smile. Perhaps. Or a rehearsal for the next act. I approached the letter and glanced at the postscript. "Tell your English detective that he was not wrong, but he was not entirely right." I raised a brow. Cryptic as ever. "Even in retreat," Holmes murmured, "she speaks as one who believes the past remains a debt unpaid." I sat across from him. "Do you think she will try again?" Holmes was quiet a moment, then said, "Not as she did before. That theatre has closed. But the impulse, to purge, to unearth, remains alive in her, and in others." "What of the cipher?" I asked. "Have you truly forgotten where it lies?" Holmes looked at me then, directly, intently. "Watson, you have seen me dismantle a man's intentions from the scrape of mud on a trouser cuff. I do not forget. I choose silence. That is something different." I nodded. It was answer enough. Later that day, as the sun reached its reluctant zenith and spilled grey-gold light across the rooftops, Holmes handed me a sealed envelope. "Should something befall me," he said, "this is to be given to Mycroft." And only to him. I held the envelope carefully. "Does he know the scope of it?" "He suspects. Mycroft always suspects." "You trust him?" "More than most," Holmes said, "but not absolutely." A silence fell between us. "And yet," I said softly, "you spared the world the truth, or at least its most dangerous truths." Holmes exhaled. "No, Watson, I postponed them. There is a difference. Every age must face its own reckoning. I merely decided this one was not ready for its absolution." I studied my friend carefully. The case had aged him, not physically, but spiritually. His usual detachment, once so invulnerable, had shown strain in the weeks since Vienna. He had stared into the abyss not of criminal madness, but of historical consequence, and it had stared back. "Tell me, Holmes," I said, "do you regret it?" He gave the barest of shrugs. "Regret is a foggy compass, Watson. I prefer memory, and in mine, the fire did not consume us." It was not until mid-March that we heard the final echo of the cipher. It came in the form of a brief note delivered by a diplomatic courier from the Vatican, addressed to Signor Villani and passed to Holmes by way of the Italian consulate. The note was unsigned, but bore the seal of a cardinal's office, and its contents were brief. "The archive has been resealed. The ledger has returned to silence. The bell shall not toll again in our time." Holmes read the note once, then placed it atop the fire without ceremony. It curled in the flame, blackened, and vanished. Villani, we learned, had returned to Florence, having accepted a curatorship at the Biblioteca Nazionale. He sent a final letter of thanks, remarking with cautious optimism that some secrets are best kept not by chains, but by men of conscience. Of Lord Marbury there was no further word. His Belgravia house was shuttered and sold to a distant cousin. His estate quietly dissolved. The newspapers noted his passing as peaceful after a long and private decline. As for the bell, the one beneath the Hofburg, it remains, Holmes believes, intact, silent, waiting. "I doubt it shall ever ring again," he said one evening as we sat before the fire. "But I also once said no man would dare touch Napoleon's death mask with a smuggler's chisel. History has no shortage of irony." In time I returned to my practice. Though I remained Holmes's companion in those cases he deemed worthy of his attention, which grew fewer and fewer. The ordinary crimes of London seemed, I think, strangely hollow after Vienna. He would take on the occasional matter of stolen art or fraudulent heirship, but never again did he speak of ciphers, nor of bells, nor of bloodlines etched in ink. And then, one fog-bound evening some 6 months hence, I found him once more seated at the window, violin in hand. He was not playing, only holding the instrument gently, almost reverently, as one might a relic. I poured him tea. He accepted it with a small nod of gratitude. "There is a line," he said at length, "in one of the lost pages from the Medici scroll, translated by De Vries, noted in the margin, 'The man who bears the fifth name must never be remembered, only endured.'" I looked up. A grim epitaph. Or an instruction. He sipped the tea. "You once asked if I regretted not burning the manuscript. I've thought of my answer. And I regret only that I could not tell the world the truth without setting it alight. I said nothing. There was nothing more to say, and perhaps that was the essence of it. Some truths are too large for men, even great men, to carry alone. Others are so terrible that they must be folded into the bones of the earth and left for time to wear away, grain by grain, until what remains is less a truth and more a parable. As the fire dwindled and the night crept in, Holmes finally raised his violin and drew the bow gently across the strings. The melody that emerged was unfamiliar, soft, mournful, yet strangely weightless. A requiem, I thought, not for a man, but for an idea. The bell had rung, the fire had come close. But the ledger was closed, and Holmes, though forever altered, had remained unburned. The game, this time, had not been merely afoot. It had been history, and history, at last, had chosen silence.